The Art of Leadership Network.
Blind spots are not our enemy. They're not our adversary. They are a gift for us to get better in how we see the world. And of course, in seeing the world rightly, we then can address the world appropriately.
Helping you design your roadmap to wholeness from the inside out. This is Win Today. And now, here's your host, Christopher Cook.
Hey friends, thanks so much for joining me today for episode 383 of the podcast. You guys, we're getting near 400 episodes here, which is pretty crazy to think about, but I'm thankful for you. I'm so glad you're here today. And I'm especially thankful to have my new friend, Terry Crist, with us for this episode. You guys, today we're discussing interrupting cancel culture, which, hello 2024, hello culture, right? We're going to talk about underestimating the driver of fear when it comes to approaching people, having proximity to people that are different than us. We're going to talk about radical individualism and what it means to weaponize boundaries. And I can say this about Terry. He's a pastor committed to building deep relationships with people, even people whose life experiences are different from his own. So I want to say this. Don't sleep on this one, guys. It's 2024. It's an election year. There's a lot of contention already fomenting in culture. You can feel it. Turn on the news. Scroll social media. We are inundated with the traumas of the world, the vitriol, every single day. And we have an opportunity, a choice to be disruptors in the culture of chaos in which we live and to hit pause. I think today's conversation is going to be that necessary pause, the reframe, the recalibration. So we're going to head there in just a moment with Terry. I'm excited to get there. But first, listen, my brand new book, Healing What You Can't Erase, hits stores tomorrow, March 19th. Today is the last day to get your free pre-order bonuses. Purchase the book anywhere books are sold, then take your proof of purchase to healingwhatyoucan'terase.com. Click the button that says get pre-order bonuses. We'll hook you up. But tomorrow, guys, the book drops, and I'm excited because my passion, my heart is to train you for transformation. That's what this book is all about. It's a roadmap to transform your mental, emotional, and spiritual health from the inside out. Hey, lastly, before we get to my conversation with Terry, if you're enjoying the podcast, please do consider sharing it. Send a text to a friend and invite them to listen too. Don't forget to rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening, especially on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts. In fact, I want to read a recent review from Apple Podcasts. This is from Chaplain JJ. Chaplain JJ wrote, "I'm so thankful for how you show up authentically with thoughtful questions and insight. You cultivate a depth of discussion that allows us to see things that can easily go unnoticed. I'm so thankful for these recent episodes with Tim Ross and Andy Andrew that are giving me words to the wall I've been wrestling with and a roadmap for transformation." Chaplain JJ, thank you so much for that generous 5-star review. And if you, like this reviewer, are receiving value from the show, I really, again, would appreciate your rating and review wherever you listen, but especially on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts. Here's the reason. When you rate, when you review, when you share Win Today, not only can we expand our listenership, but we get to tell even more people that transformation beats self-help all day long. It really is as simple as that. You guys, thanks so much for your listenership, for your support, for your encouragement and excitement about my brand new book, Healing What You Can't Erase. It drops tomorrow. Come hang out with me on Instagram at Win Today Chris. I've got a bunch of really fun stuff planned to celebrate with you this week, like free Starbucks coffee giveaways, like Instagram live conversations with some of my favorite people, and a brand new broadcast channel on Instagram called Transformation Training. Come hang out with us. It is under the hood, in-depth, power-packed conversations, and I want you to be a part of it. So come find me on Instagram at Win Today Chris. Everything is right there. But right now, let's get to today's featured conversation with Terry Crist. You're listening to Win Today on the Art of Leadership Network. Terry, welcome to the podcast. I just got to say off the bat, it has been such a joy and a privilege to get to know you and Judith, and you guys are just good people, and I'm thankful for the conversation we're going to have today. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be back with you. In the interest of full disclosure, we had this conversation recently, and I had some technical difficulties on my end, and you were kind enough to give me another at-bat. So we love you. We're so excited, by the way, for your upcoming book.
Thank you.
Soon to come out, Healing What You Can't Erase. And I read that preview chapter that sneak peek chapter and read a little about your experience and the loss of your mother, and got a sense that this book is really going to be helpful for a lot of people. So looking forward to reading it.
You're so kind. Thank you. It's really interesting because diving into, you and I were talking offline here before we hit record and talking about the cathartic nature, therapeutic nature of writing, and even some of the challenges of writing. You and I are both authors, and like when we have to go back into our stories, it's hard. It's really hard.
You relive them. It puts you right back into the situation. And I think for some writers, depending upon the content that they're writing, it triggers a lot of trauma and causes you to relive some really painful moments in life, which then causes me to wonder, am I reliving this because I'm writing it, or would I be naturally processing through this apart from me being present to the page? And I don't know the answer to that, but what I do know is that God is kind and gracious and compassionate. And more often than not, when we tell our stories to others, they find life and healing in them. And we find life and healing in telling them.
That's so good. Yeah, I mean, I'll just speak to that for a moment because I asked myself the same question. You know, the book, here we are in at the time of airing, March 2024. So I got up and I wrote the book in the summer of 22. And yeah, that was my experience. I thought, oh my gosh, am I actually reliving trauma again? Or am I just feeling the residue of maybe even unhealed levels of wounds? It was truly a physiological experience for me writing. And so, yeah, what you said is so true.
And writing the kind of book that you are writing, have written, and is soon coming out, is a real gift to people because it's not easy to relive those moments. It's not easy to be present to that when the season has changed. And yet the gift in that is that there are other people who will read what you've written, who are right where you were when the healing began in your life. And they're going to find comfort. They're going to find Jesus on the pages of your book. And of course, that's most important.
Terry, thank you so much. Hey, I want to ask you a question, I suppose, before we get into the meat of this. Moments before we hit record here today, you had briefly mentioned to me really the power of focus and what's available to us through the power of focus when we live focused lives. Will you just speak to that a little bit? I think even the power of focus can segue into talking about how to be effective in relationships and all of that.
Well, as light bearers, as light in a dark world, we're either going to diffuse our light or we're going to concentrate our light in such a way so that the gospel lives through us, the truth of Jesus lives through us. And I think the importance of living by focus is that we, first of all, it requires us to summon ourselves, who we are, what God has placed in us. It requires that we put a demand on the investment that he's deposited within our lives, and we steward that in an intentional way. And I think you and I have spoken about intentionality in our previous conversation.
For sure, Jay.
If we don't live intentional lives, and we're not going to have the kind of outcomes that God has placed us here on the earth at this moment in history to have. So the idea of living a highly intentional life is so that God is glorified through my life, so that others see him in and through me, and that their lives are impacted for the better. That leads to human flourishing, not just for us, but for the communities that we're situated in.
Human flourishing, I want to stick on that phrase. That's really brilliant. Okay, if we combine the ideas of focus and living an intentional life and the power of flourishing, and when we live flourishing lives, what can impede that is a polarizing us versus them posture in life, and not ignoring the fact today that we are in an election year. This is a relevant conversation for us today. I want to start here then, Terry. All of us have blind spots in life, blind spots that impede our ability to flourish, blind spots that impede our focus, blind spots that stand in the way of us living, as you said so brilliantly, intentional lives. How do we unintentionally harbor a tribalistic posture in and through our everyday lives in ways that we might not even recognize as being such?
Sure. Well, let me set the context before I answer the question directly. Let me just begin by talking about the difference between tribes and tribalism. Because I think, Christopher, we're all tribal by nature, and all of us belong to tribes. So tribes are simply the communities that we form and are included in. And tribes are not bad. In fact, tribes are a gift. When I think about ancient Israel was a nation of tribes. Jesus was born into a tribe, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So the tribes in Israel were the same but different. They were united but diverse. And God's plan for them was for them to interact and for them to overlap and for them to integrate with one another while at the same time maintaining distinctives. So tribalism is what happens when we don't maintain unity in diversity. Tribalism is what happens when one group seeks to eliminate another group. The in-group decides that the out-group doesn't have a right to exist because it's a threat to the existence of the in-group. So I don't think tribes are the problem. Tribalism is the problem. It's when we take the beauty of community and we then weaponize it to the exclusion of other people. So to answer your question directly, the only, I think, two ways that I know to address any sort of a blind spot, and particularly as it relates to tribes and polarization, is, first of all, I have to read the scriptures with an open heart, a heart that says, search me, O God. Show me the ways that I behave that are sinful or harmful or just not helpful. And then as David prayed, teach me your ways. So as we read the scripture with a heart of humility, the scripture then reads us. And as the scripture reads us, it begins to surface the blind spots in our life, the blind spots that relate to community and polarization. Then finally, the second thing I would say in direct answer is to build trusted relationships with people who are not exactly like you and allow them to point out what you may not be seeing about yourself and the world and your behavior and how you interact with others. And the reason that we need a diverse group of relationships in our lives is because that the chance is highly likely if we're looking at people who look like us, who think like us, who are in the same demographic as we are, then there's a chance that they may have the same blind spots. So in searching the scripture and in trusting relationships, blind spots are surfaced in our lives. And once they're surfaced, they're a gift. Blind spots are not our enemy. They're not our adversary. They are a gift for us to get better in how we see the world. And of course, in seeing the world rightly, we then can address the world appropriately.
It's really amazing. I'd love to double click on a few things you said. This phrase hit me like a ton of bricks. Unity in diversity. So here's the question. Can you unpack for us unity versus uniformity?
Sure. So if I could just kind of go back, and I know you've got a very broad and diverse audience of viewership and podcast listeners, and many of them are professionals. Sure. I'm a pastor. So what I'm going to say is going to come through the lens of being a pastor, being a one who loves the church, loves Jesus, and sees all of life through that framework. When I think about ancient Israel, I think about the beauty of diversity in that tribal system, that tribal economy. We hear the word Israel and we think everyone is the same. But in ancient Israel, you had tribes who lived in the mountains and tribes who were on the coast. So you had tribes who were sort of our hillbilly cousins. And then you had the Californians who were there where the new thought came along the trade routes of the day. So they weren't uniform. There was no uniformity. It was purely unity based upon diversity. But it was based upon, number one, a common love for God and a common commitment to one another. And this is what Jesus summarizes all of the law and the prophets in the Gospels, that we should love God and we should love others. So the idea of loving God and loving others means that I'm going to extend kindness and compassion and justice to people who don't look like me, think like me, and act like me. And I'm going to do that not simply on the basis of being a humanitarian, but on the basis of what God has extended to me. God has extended his best to me. Therefore, I can extend that and should extend that to other people.
Okay, let's tie this into relationships then, because One of the things you said that I think is a distinction for all of us entering into quality relationships is that the fabric of our trust shouldn't therefore be upon points of agreement. In other words, I'd like to propose that if we forge a relationship based upon things we agree upon instead of shared value, when there's a disagreement, what happens to the bedrock of the relationship itself? Will you unpack just a little bit? If the fabric of trust in a relationship shouldn't be points of agreement, true trust then, Terry, across the spectrum is forged by what?
I think we have to begin with the Imago Dei. We have to begin with the fact that we all share something essential and fundamental in common. We may not all share the same view on religion and politics, but we're human beings and we've been created in the image of a loving God, and we all fundamentally want the same thing out of life. You know, I've traveled into 65 countries and I've been privileged to meet a lot of different people. And I will say more often than not, people want the same things. They may be in different cultures. They may have different identities that they allow to define them or define themselves by. But fundamentally, they want to be seen. They want to be heard. They want to be loved. They want to be healthy. They want to be encouraged and championed. So I think the fundamental thing that binds us together as a basis for unity is the Imago Dei, that we are image bearers, that we all are fundamentally the same. And it's important to be reminded of that, Chris, because I think we make broad assumptions about all people without having conversations with them. So we fill in a lot of blanks when it comes to the people around us. We say that all blank people are blank. Whatever the descriptor is, we have this way of filling in the blanks without having conversations. And sometimes we never get to the conversation because we don't think we have anything by way of association or connection. So I'm coming back to the idea that we do have a connection. And that connection is we are human beings. We are human beings. We have been formed by a loving God, in the image of a loving God. And on the basis of being human beings, on the basis of that commonality, we can extend dignity and worth and kindness and compassion. And I want people to know Jesus. So hopefully in extending that to others, they come to faith in Jesus. But even if they never come to faith in Jesus, it's not a wasted investment. It is me living out God's plan in and through me without any outcome, as a commitment, as a guarantee. So can I come back to one other thing? You go ahead.
No. Come back to you're on a hot streak here. Go for it, Terry, and then I'll come back. It's good.
So I wanted to come back to the tribalism thing because I threw a lot in there.
Yep.
I think the opposite of tribalism is individualism, right? So we live in a world that is both hyper tribalistic and hyper individualistic. And I am not a mental health professional. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist. And you have a lot of those extraordinarily gifted people on your show. So again, I'm going to speak as a pastor and as a practitioner of my faith. Those ideologies, in my perspective, sit on the opposite ends of a spectrum, but they have one thing in common. Both of them are about me and mine and not we and ours.
That's it.
So whether it's tribalism or it's hyper-individualism, it's about me. It's about mine. And that's not unnatural. I think that is sort of baked into us as human beings. But I do believe, as those who are followers of Jesus, we are to be about more than just our own. We have to move beyond the tribalism and the individualism to community. Community for the sake of the gospel, but community for the sake of human flourishing. So to that word earlier, even if people never come to faith in the gospel as I believe it, I still bear the responsibility of contributing to the common good and of creating conditions that lead to human flourishing for all people everywhere at all times.
So this is fascinating because here we are talking about the polar opposites of radical individualism and tribalism, yet there's this thread through it, which you said is the focus on me. I want to put a pin in this because underpinning that motivation, I believe, is a shame narrative. Shame says self-protect. self-promote, hide. We see it in the garden. But I want to go back to something quickly. You made this incredible statement about how we fill in blanks without having the conversation first. This plays into the shame thought. Terry, if we fill in the blanks without having conversations with people, Brene Brown says it this way, it's hard to hate people up close. And I love that statement. Mm-hmm. If we're filling in the blanks without having in the conversation, what are the blanks, Terry? Shame, self-protection, self-righteousness, assumptions. What fills and occupies the spaces called blanks? And then we'll just connect that to what we were talking about regarding radical individualism.
Yeah, and we'd love to talk about shame. I feel like you have a lot more to say looking at the table of contents and even what you can't erase
You're so kind.
than I probably have to share. But Christopher, I would say fear. Fear. We underestimate the power of fear. And we underestimate fear as a driver, a driver in the human condition. And I think oftentimes when we fail to have these conversations with people that lead to understanding, if not agreement, and I want to make sure that we differentiate between the two, because every conversation is not going to lead to agreement, but at least they can lead to a better understanding. And when we allow fear to keep us divided, then we never get to these conversations. And fear has a way of just being compounded more and more over time. So the reason that people exist in these opposite ends oftentimes of hyper-tribalistic behaviors, tribalism, and hyper-individualistic behaviors and individualism, they're there because of fear. They're there because of what they've been told about the other, about what their intentions are, what their ambitions are, how that the other is trying to take away our freedoms and remap the world and convert us and make us like them. And so what does fear do? Fear says, well, I don't want any of that. And so I've got to run or resist. I've got to hide or overwhelm them.
Wow. Okay. This is fabulous. Because this is my favorite thing to do with guests. And I'm so thankful we're in this conversation because I like to get under the hood of the issue to inspect the issue behind the issue. You said, in a sense, we underestimate this driver called fear. What specifically, Terry, do we unintentionally underestimate and overlook? Like, what is the insidious nature of fear that feeds all of these reflexive behaviors? In other words, fear is actually more powerful than we on the surface recognize. And because we don't take it for what it is, in many cases, it dominates our motivations in life. Take us under the hood of really the driver of fear, how insidious it really is.
Sure. I think if you look at the history of humanity, the history of community division and national conflict, more often than not, you're going to see fear there. Mm-hmm. And I know it sounds reductionistic. A couple of years ago, I was in a doctoral program, and at that time, I had spent 3 years doing research on racial inequity in Pentecostal movements. And sat in meeting after meeting during the research phase of the degree, where that I was in rooms with people asking questions, conducting workshops, surveying communities that felt disconnected and were vulnerable. And I kept hearing this over and over again. It's fear. It's fear. Fear was the driver in slavery. Fear is the driver in war. Fear is the driver. Scarcity thinking. I'm afraid that if I don't take ground and keep ground and deprive others of the ground that I've taken and am trying to keep, that I won't have enough. So fear's the driver. And I kept thinking, Chris, this is just too simple. It's just too simple. And then I heard Jamar Tisby in The Color of Compromise come back to this issue, that in his research as well, he had stumbled upon the fact that oppression and discrimination, more often than not, is driven by fear. So I think we've got to come back and do a lot of work there. And it's a big topic, but I would encourage people to look at that in their own lives. How does fear drive your behavior? How does scarcity thinking drive your behavior? How does it drive us to over what, to under what? to medicate, to self-medicate. It drives addictions. It drives, family trauma. And it's a big topic, even bigger than what we're talking about here. Certainly isn't part of the book that I'm discussing, but I do think the underpinnings are there. And so here's what the antithesis is: love. Love. So Jesus comes to show us not the way of fear, but he comes to show us the way of love. And love is what drives out fear. Love for the other, love for neighbor, love for stranger. It is in loving other people that we dislodge fear and the stranglehold that fear has on communities and on families and individuals. And we replace that with God's heart for humanity. Boy, you get me in the second and third question. It's always that follow-up question that you're the expert. It opens up door after door after door.
Well, I got another one because it's this. So I'm trying to run a thread through the meta-narrative of this conversation because I see this clarion call from you to move toward people. Number one, I'd like to propose that every relationship in our lives is either moving toward connection or toward disconnection. So please correct me if you think I'm off base in this, but in hearing your take on this, Terry, what I hear you saying in a way is the spirit of fear, the insidious, devious spirit of fear, empowers shame and a shame narrative. Shame manifests, I believe, in self-protection or self-promotion, in which case we either hide ourselves, like in Genesis 3 in the garden,
right,
or we assert ourselves in an overtly insecure manner. Now, again, hiding or asserting, neither of these move us toward connection, but instead disconnection. So our primal motivation is like, at the end of the day, I want to feel safe, right? Now, folks, lean in because we're going to unravel this a little bit. Our core motivation, Terry, in life is I want to be safe, but we think shame, isolation, scarcity is going to keep us small and safe, but it's actually just going to keep us small. I'd like to suggest, and I'd love your comment on this, that when we eradicate the tentacles of fear and shame in our lives, we will move toward connection, and in connection, find the safety we really want, versus disconnection that moves us towards scarcity. I would just love sort of your biopsy on that as like a sociological construct.
Yeah, I love what you're saying there, and I think you've got some better handles on it than I probably even do. I love what you mentioned a moment ago. So we see the entrance of fear in Genesis 3. We have no record of fear prior to that. So fear just suddenly shows up in the human condition. But prior to that, we have, love and acceptance and God's presence with humanity. And then fear shows up. What gives entrance to fear? Well, it's believing a lie. So it comes out of this conversation between the enemy and the woman. And the lie that is you're not good enough. The lie is that God's depriving you. The lie is that if you eat of the fruit, you're going to be like God and your eyes are going to be open, which of course introduces the idea that you're insufficient now and God's depriving you. He's trying to keep you from living your highest and best self. So I think this is what fear often does. Fear lies to us. And when fear lies to us, it then shapes an identity in us that is other than the identity formed by God and formed in love. So Adam and Eve suddenly see themselves through a new framework, through a new lens, a lens of scarcity and insufficiency, a lack of deprivation, or a sense of deprivation and lack. And that becomes the defining narrative in their life. And when fear becomes the voice that rules our inner world, when fear becomes the voice that dominates the landscape of our life, then fear produces in and through us another outcome, one other than what God had planned for our lives. So fear oftentimes creates mistaken identities, and it drives us toward a behavior that is incongruent with the way of love. The beauty of this whole story is that Jesus comes to bring us back to the heart of God. And in coming back to the heart of God, we come back to our true and essential selves. We come back to generosity. We come back to a life overflowing, but all that comes through a connection with God. The lie causes us to be misshapen and mistaken about who we are, but the truth causes us to be perfectly formed in God's plan for our lives.
What are some common lies that you think we believe? And it makes me think of Jesus from John chapter 8, I think it's around verse 44. And he refers to the devil and he says, when the enemy lies, he speaks his native language. Talk about some of the most common lies, Terry, that you think we overlook and lies that we're like, oh yeah, that's just my normal thought life, but they're actually lies.
Yeah, the most fundamental is you're not enough. You're not enough. So if we go back to this original lie, the genesis of lies, the fountainhead of lies, it is you're not enough. And we're talking about humanity recently formed, still wet with the fingerprints of God. We're talking about, creation in its purest form. And yet the enemy comes in and says, you're not enough. You're not man enough. You're not woman enough. You're not smart enough. You're not fast enough. You're not talented enough. You're just not enough. So the basis of that takes on a lot of different iterations throughout our lives. It can take on, a certain form as a student. Everyone else is smarter than me. Everyone else is brighter than me. Everyone else is going to succeed and I'm not going to. It can take on an expression as a mom. I'm just not good enough as a mom. I'm doing my best. As a thought leader, as a business woman or business person. It shows up consistently in our lives in a lot of different forms, but basically the root of it is you are not enough. Contrast that with what happens when we come to faith in Jesus and we're made complete in him and we're made new in him and we're made sufficient in him. I want people to know that by putting your faith in Jesus, you not only secure your life for eternity, but you receive the assurance that you are who God made you to be, things that you couldn't control, to what family you were born to what community you were born in. And once you know who you are, then you begin to live out a different story. In fact, I've often put it this way. Mistaken identity results in a wrong behavior. So if you can convince a person that they are an indentured person, a slave, an enslaved person, even though they may be the inheritor of all things, if you've convinced them of some alternate reality apart from truth, then you have formed their personhood. Mistaken identity results in a wrong behavior. This is why we have to know who we are in Christ, because in knowing who we are in Christ, we discover our true selves, our child of God selves. But until we come to know that, we're just going to live out one identity after another. It leaves us hollow, leaves us empty, leaves us frustrated because they're based upon lies that we believe, not the truths that set us free.
Folks, I want you to remember that, Terry, you said mistaken identity results in wrong behavior. That's really powerful. I want to swing this into talking about betrayal then, because there are folks joined with us today who have experienced devastating betrayal in relationships. And the reflex is, ouch, that hurt. Why would I risk being hurt again? And therefore, the safest place to be is in and of myself. Betrayal is devastating. Speak to those who have been burned and betrayed in relationships in the context of this conversation, because there's the difference, Terry, between setting boundaries and becoming isolated and reclusive. What is that difference, and how do we really hedge against the posture of self-protection and isolation?
Great questions. I think fundamentally, it's important for us to realize, first of all, that we're all coming from dysfunction. We're all coming from imperfection. So when we come back to these idea about the lies that we tell ourselves, I'm not good enough, I'm not perfect enough, I'm not whatever enough, it's just really important to come back to the fact, to remind ourselves that we're all coming from some sort of a dysfunction or another. In fact, the only functional human being in history was Jesus, and the rest of us are somewhere else on the spectrum. So if you keep leaving dysfunctional people, eventually you're going to break up with yourself. And I just want to make sure that we're clear on that.
Whoa.
So we can get healthier. We can set boundaries. I'm coming at your question as I do with every question.
I love it.
The long circuitous route. But I do want everybody to know that fundamentally we're all dysfunctional. And if we live with the illusion that a couple of decisions, a book from Terry on loving Samaritans, a book from Christopher on healing what you can't erase, we're just going to resolve this. Can I just say that's not realistic? So what we should ask, however, is the question, is this the kind of dysfunction that comes from a place that is ill-intentioned? Or is this the kind of dysfunction that is the result of sincere but incompetent people? Because again, we're all messy. We all are incompetent. Is this the kind of dysfunction that is harmful? Or is this the kind of dysfunction that we all need to just sort of accept at some level? And I know that's hard. But we have to accept some level of dysfunction in life. And here's what we do. We want others to accept our dysfunction, but we want to hold them accountable for theirs. And this is a big issue in leadership today, in a cancel culture where the judgment of the crowds demands immediate and public crucifixions. So we're creating a culture where no one can meet the standard. And what's going to happen if we don't find a way to interrupt this is that leaders are either going to double down on their weaknesses as a survival mechanism, or they're going to become professional hypocrites in order to survive. So we have got to, number one, come to know, is this dysfunction ill-intentioned? Is it harmful? Is it destructive? How do we do that? Well, we come back to the scriptures. We look at the person of Jesus, because that's how we know truth. We don't know truth by looking at the culture around us.
Come on, Terry.
We don't know truth by listening to religious leaders. We know truth by coming back to the scriptures and by seeing Jesus. Jesus is the full embodiment of truth. And if we look at Jesus, then we understand truth. And then I would encourage people as well to broaden your relational circle and interact with a wide range of people and groups and churches and denominations, and keep your heart open to the way God is working in and through other people. And if we'll do that, I think that we all will have a better perspective on how to draw boundaries. Now, I have a complicated relationship with boundaries. I have a very complicated relationship with boundaries. And the reason I do is because I think that boundaries are helpful, but I also think people have weaponized boundaries. And I know you've had the boundaries guy on that I have immense respect for, and I learn from him consistently. But I think we need to ask ourselves the question, are the boundaries helpful or are they harmful? Are the boundaries a way of protecting our identity, or are the boundaries keeping us from growth? Okay, so we can talk more about that.
Sure, that's huge.
I've seen people who set up boundaries with God, boundaries with Jesus. And the life that I know that leads to flourishing is a cruciform life. It is the life of laying down my life before Jesus. Not the life of becoming a doormat, but the kind of life that says, okay, God, I'm going to serve others. I'm going to wash the feet of others. I'm going to go places that make me uncomfortable. I'm going to engage with people that are unlike me. And I'm not going to do that because that I enjoy it. I'm going to do that because that, number one, I'm made better by interacting with people not like me. And number two, Jesus might work through me to do something beneficial to them. So when it comes to the idea of boundaries, let's set the right boundaries, but not the wrong boundaries. And let's set boundaries with the people that are ill-intentioned, not just living our lives behind walls and barriers. Does that make sense? Do you hear what I'm trying to get to there? So boundaries are helpful, but we have to evaluate why we use them. I guess that's what I'm trying to do.
That's what I was getting at is, okay, motivation Is the motivation actually health for the value of the relationship that moves us toward connection, or is the motivation of using boundaries self-protection because of a spirit of fear?
Exactly. Well put. Because I've seen people use boundaries to keep Jesus in check. And a part of living the cruciform life, a part of being a servant to all, a part of walking in the way of Jesus and practicing the way of Jesus is mean that I can't insulate my life to the point where I'm always going to be comfortable, where I'm always going to feel, affirmed and loved. I've got to go some dangerous places. I've got to love some risky people. I've got to take some chances on some relationships that aren't going to turn out the way that I had hoped, and then I've got to do it all over again. And this is what it means to live for a higher purpose and for a higher cause, and to live for a greater good, not just necessarily my own good. Now, I do want to, as you keep saying, put a pin in it and add real quickly that I'm not talking about someone staying in a relationship that is harmful,
exactly
and destructive.
That's right,
I'm not talking about a wife staying in a relationship that is abusive and that is volatile and destructive to her emotional health, let alone her physical well-being. I'm not saying that.
Right.
I'm just saying that we're in a generation right now where we just draw boundaries really, really, really quickly and easily and casually. And we do it with nations. We do it with borders. We do it with demographics. We do it with psychographics. And we're just a people that are so boundaried in right now that nobody's loving beyond the point of discomfort. And I'm calling people back to loving Samaritans, to loving people that are not like us, and being uncomfortable, being comfortable with the discomfort, because that's the space that grace operates in. And that's where love does its finest work of transformation. And that's where we grow. So you talked earlier about Pete Scazzaro. We grow in discomfort. We grow when we're in these places in our lives where we're just saying, God, what are you doing in this moment? And we just don't feel as if we are, protected. But man, that's the hotbed for spiritual growth. And can I tell you, following Jesus will put you in some risky business. I used to think that if you follow Jesus, he'll never send you anyplace dangerous. And now I believe that if you follow Jesus, he will primarily send you to dangerous places. That's where peacemakers go. That's where ambassadors of reconciliation go. That's where the followers of Jesus go. It took him to the cross. Why would it cost us any less?
In a way, we're talking about emotional maturity and the need for emotional maturity in this conversation. Will you splice apart the difference between being a peacemaker and a peacekeeper? I just don't want folks to walk away today going, oh, I think what I heard Terry say is I'm a doormat now. Peacekeeper's like, I'm just here to keep the peace. That's not what a peacemaker is.
You're here to actively make peace. And what is peace? Peace is the shalom of God. Peace is wholeness. Peace is human flourishing. And we can't get there when we have an enemy of peace. So back to the verse you quoted earlier about the father of lies.
That's right,
What is
Johnny.
the purpose of fear? Fear to bring division. Fear is to separate people. Fear is to diminish us. I heard somebody say the other day that fear diminishes us by 20 IQ points. So not only does it do that personally and individually, leads us to our lower brain, our lizard brain, our lesser way of thinking, but it does that in our relationships. So I'm not at all suggesting that people become doormats. I'm suggesting that it takes a greater strength to be a peacemaker. When Jesus sent the disciples out as sheep among wolves, anybody can be a wolf. Anybody can be divisive. Anybody can be destructive. It takes the greater strength to be a sheep, a lamb, to put yourself in a place of vulnerability as an act of mission, as an act of intentionality. And this is what we're talking about. We're talking about people who willingly put themselves in places for the good of humanity, not just people who surrender to the forces of evil as doormats. I'm not at all talking about becoming a doormat. That's an easy way to live. I'm talking about the higher way of living intentionally and making peace, having courageous but not contentious conversations, opening subjects with people, but then listening for where where they're coming from, doing what you do so well, asking the second and the third question beyond that, trying to get to these pain points in the culture so that we can bring the presence of Jesus to them.
Moving toward people is such a needed posture today. I'm curious about this. Take this wherever you want. When does empathy for someone's unique perspective on life and their lived experience get overextended to the point where we become codependent in a way, we enable untruth, we enable dysfunction for the sake of just keeping the peace?
It's a great question. And I would suggest that when we get to those conditions that you've described, I think if we're overextended, if we are in relationships that are codependent, that aren't helpful, rather than just saying, what's wrong with the other person, we probably need to come back and take another look at our interior lives and take a look at our own spiritual formation. I think of Jesus. Jesus knew when it was time, say draw boundaries. He knew when it was time to withdraw. He knew how to keep his interior world healthy. And if I'm living out of a healthy interior world, then I don't really think about, this is why I'm trying to get to this question right here. I don't actually live that kind of way, Christopher, where I think about, am I overextended? Am I in an unhealthy relationship? Am I codependent? I don't really know how to answer that sort of a question because I don't live that sort of way. I live the sort of way where that I'm consistently working on my own spiritual formation. And then I do my best to be led by the Spirit. And so if I feel that, okay, this is just not healthy, then I'm going to ask the question first, how do I make it healthy? And maybe that would lead to pulling back from a relationship. That would be something that I have done on occasion in my life. That would be, but even then it wouldn't be a matter of self-protection. It would be a matter of being led by the Spirit, knowing that it's not just for my good that I might need to pull back from this relationship, but it's also for their good as well. And I think that if we live the kind of lives that are well-formed, lives that are led by the Spirit, some of this stuff just becomes natural. So if I ask you right now, how are you breathing? How are you thinking?
Yeah.
You're just going to say, I'm being.
Yeah.
I'm just being. So what you and I have talked about before and what I'm really passionate about is calling people into a way of being that is natural because it's supernatural, that flows out of their interior lives, that isn't drawing from a toolbox, a tool here and a tool here and a tool here, but it's being formed in such a way that these tools are just natural to us. And they're the natural responses that come from a supernatural source of life, and that is being connected to the Spirit of God.
I'm trying to think about how to put a bow on this conversation because you've taken us in so many different ways, and it's so good.
Ways, bro.
Like moving toward people, I love this phrase, this word really, withness, requires what? Let's talk about even communication strategies.
Okay.
What communication strategies do you believe are effective in fostering constructive dialogue then? Even with people with whom we have great disagreement, rather than reinforcing divisions, keeping us in the silo, in self-protection, in isolation?
Sure. Withness is really about being with people in presence, being with them in their hopes and fears and hurts and longings and desire for a better life, and not just being with them as in close physical proximity, but being with them in close emotional and spiritual proximity. The whole idea of witness for me is really based on the incarnation. The incarnation is a religious term that describes God being man. So though he was and is fully God, Jesus had to become one of us. He had to move into the neighborhood with us in order to rescue us. And in being one of us, he knew what it was like to be human. He was hungry. He was tired. He was angry. He was frustrated. He was joyful. He was hopeful. He was tempted. Jesus was tempted just as we are. So the idea of the incarnation is God's way of coming into the world. And God wants every one of us then, as his people, to be incarnated. So this is the ongoing incarnation of God in the world today. It is God moving into the world consistently and faithfully. It's what Jesus does in John 17 when he sends the disciples out as sheep among wolves. And he prays not that God would isolate them from the world, but that God would keep them and that he would protect them and that he would use them for his glory. So here's the prayer. Don't withdraw, but engage. Don't hide, but move out toward people. God is always moving out toward people. And as we live on mission, we're always going to be moving out toward people. And ultimately, I think that our witness to the world is based upon our witness. Are we with people? So how do we do that practically? Well, we do that through things like curiosity, curious conversations, deep listening, finding a way to walk through our communities a little slower, seeking common good, realizing that, as I said earlier, we have more in common with people than we don't have in common with people. And to me, it is fundamentally about having a lot of conversations. Hospitality matters. I think God cares more about hospitality than we can even imagine. So we find in Scripture this word philoxenia, which means love of strangers, as opposed to xenophobia, which is fear of strangers. So we are either going to live in the way where we are loving strangers or we're afraid of them. We're moving toward them or moving away from them. And that can be as simple as having 1,000 conversations with people, listening to them, being curious, being compassionate, a commitment to the right tone, a commitment to time. Sometimes conversations unfold over the course of years. And then a willingness, I would say, to just live in the tensions of life. We like to wrap things up in life and put neat bows on them and bring resolutions to them. And a part of following the way of Jesus is just being willing to live in the tensions of life. The tensions aren't a bad place to be. They're the place where grace shows up and where grace is extended.
What a period on that sentence. Terry, thank you. Thank you so much. Your book, Loving Samaritans, I'd say is a very relevant message for today. I'll land here. Why this book now? Why this message now? I mean, I think our cultural moment begs for it, but I want to hear your heart on that, and then I want to hear more about how to connect with you.
Well, we live in a profoundly divided world, and that's nothing new. What I do think is new is the fact that there are people today that are using division intentionally as a weapon to build their own kingdom, to separate families and churches and denominations. And I'm really trying to push back against that by bringing the way of Jesus. We don't need a better method. We don't need a better model. We have Jesus, this Jesus who throughout the Gospels listened deeply to people, had curious conversations with people. In fact, we see throughout the Gospels that Jesus is asked something like 112 or 113 questions. He only answers 2 or 3 of them. So he's not about being a doormat. He's not about allowing other people to control the narrative, but he is about being with them and engaging with them and making them feel seen and feel heard and feel known and feel loved. And that's what I think the church has to get back to, because there are a lot of people in our world today who have rejected the gospel, not because of the content of the gospel, but they've rejected the gospel because of the tone in which the gospel is being communicated. And this is not new to us. Paul warned us about this. We see this in the scriptures, how that we can preach Christ in contention. Philippians 1. If you preach Christ in contention, there's a little value because at least the message of Jesus is getting out. But the greater value is that when you preach the gospel in the tone of Jesus, when we preach the message of Jesus in the spirit of Jesus. And this is what I'm trying to get back to, because I don't think people are leaving the church because of the core content of the gospel. I don't think that generations are saying no to Jesus because of the content of the gospel, but it's the church hasn't really deliver the gospel in the spirit of Jesus. And if we do that, there are people that we've written off that we'll see come back to faith and people who will come to faith. And I want to see us represent Jesus well.
Can I ask you one more question?
Sure.
You can take this wherever you want, but you and I love the Lord. We love the local church. I believe in the local church. I know you do too. And yet we see right now people running away from it for various reasons. Where there's been betrayal, hurt in the church by people who represent the King, like, Terry, you don't have to get into your story at any length if you don't want to. You can say anything you want, but you're a pastor. Why are you still in it? With the amount of people leaving and the hurt and the chaos and it's like every other week. Thank God I look up to a man like you who's a man of integrity and character. Like, we see ministry leaders falling. Terry, why are you still in it? Like, you're in Phoenix. Why don't you go work at the TPC Scottsdale or something like that,
I remember this occasion.
And I hope that's okay to even ask that.
No, it's great.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm thinking of this moment when Jesus said some pretty hard things and the crowds left. They left, and he turns to the disciples and said, "Will you leave as well?" And they said, "Where else do we go? I mean, we don't have a plan B. Mm-hmm. You alone have the words of eternal life." So I follow Jesus, even though that I've been through my share of church hurt, just as you have, just as most people have. And I'm sad to say sometimes I've been the perpetrator of church hurt. So I want to be clear on the fact that I've been a victim, but I've probably unintentionally hurt other people along the process. Nobody gets into ministry to hurt other people. No one becomes a pastor to hurt other people. Well, there may be that one person out there, but I don't know them. But I know good people who've made decisions out of a deficit, who've made decisions that have been, unhelpful. And so we end up hurting people over time. But when it all comes back down to the bottom line, I'm reminded that not only does Jesus alone have the words of eternal life, but he loves the local church. So for me, I'm going to keep working on it. I'm going to keep growing as a leader. I'm going to continue to humble myself. And when I get it wrong, say, I'm sorry. I'm not an expert here. I am following in Jesus in real time, just as is every person in our church. And I do think leaders have an entrustment and a stewardship. And we need to be a little ahead, perhaps, of the people that we're leading. But man, we're all learning. The world's changed in 1,000 or 1,000,000 different ways. And we're learning as we lead, and we're leading in real time. And so I want to give myself grace, Chris, and I want to give others grace. And I hope that they'll give themselves grace and extend grace to me as well. And if we all keep working on these things, if we all keep committed to the outcome of unity and diversity, of living lives free from shame and from fear, lives that are grounded in kindness and compassion, lives that have the other as the center of our interest, then we're going to get it right more often than we get it wrong. And that's what I'm committed to, getting it right more than I get it wrong.
Terry, Crist, you're a gift. Thank you for today. I mean, today, just a refreshing, challenging conversation for sure, because all of us experience hurt, all of us experience loss and pain, but we just can't be defined by it. And sadly, so many people are defined by it and then make definitions for how they're going to live out their future. And I don't want to be one of those who does it. I want to own my mistakes. I want to clean up my messes. I want to walk in character and integrity and with clean hands and a pure heart before the Lord. And I know that's your heart too. So
when I think about God's plan for us, his plan for us involves community, as we've been discussing, and us being with one another. There are over 100 references in the New Testament to one another. So that's over and against individualism. It's over and against polarization. It's over against all of these things that we see in the culture today. We are better together. And I just want to encourage people, even though it's easier at times to just check out on people, check out on relationships, check out on humanity, check out on church. I'm not suggesting suggesting this is the easier way, but I am saying that the harder way in this case is the better way. And if we'll continue to one another, each other, if we'll continue to draw big circles and to champion each other and include one another, that we're going to be better for having done it, but we're also going to see people around us have the opportunity to become better as well.
So good. Terry, thanks for being here today. I would love for folks to stay connected to you. Tell them how to do that.
Yeah, I think a couple of ways that people could connect with me is, first of all, through Instagram. I'm on Instagram pretty consistently, and my handle is Terry Crist. And then also a website, terrycrist.com. But most importantly, I'm here in Phoenix at City of Grace Church, and I have the opportunity to pastor here and to serve here and to be a part of a community. And so if people are ever in Phoenix for a vacation, drop into City of Grace.
So beautiful.
I'd love to shake your hand, love to say hi, love to learn what you're learning, because we can all be better together.
Come on. Terry, thanks for being here today. Really, really an enriching and enlivening conversation, and I'm thankful for it.
Thanks, brother. Looking forward to more conversations with you in the future.
Yeah, it's going to be good. Well, I love Terry. I love his wife, Judith. They are good people, and I hope that conversation added value to you. Head to the show notes now at wintoday.tv/episode 383. That's wintoday.tv/episode 383. You can get a copy of Terry's brand new book right there. We'll listen next time on the podcast. We're diving into all things my book, Healing What You Can't Erase. It's a series called Healing What You Can't Erase Beyond the Book, and we are taking a deep dive from chapter 6 of my book with a man named Dave. Dave is my mentor, counselor, leader, and we're talking about the art of surrender and why surrender releases power in our lives. It's one of the most vulnerable conversations I've ever had. It's up close, personal, and as I said, under the hood of my brand new book, Healing What You Can't Erase. Here's a preview.
Yeah, because there's the healing of the initial pain. There's the adjustment of how you viewed that villain, that attack, that front that came to you. Then, ongoing, it may never completely disappear. You know, I tell people, when you read the Old Testament, the Philistines just never go away forever. It never goes away because there are certain enemies that don't leave permanently. Even Jesus, when he defeated Satan, the temptations in Matthew 4, he went away for a time. Like there's certain things life means. If I'm going to move forward, there's always going to be an enemy. It's always going to be there.
The new book drops tomorrow. The new series starts this Wednesday. We'll see you then. Thanks again for joining me this week. I believe you should be able to live at your best in your relationships, in your mental and emotional health, and in your personal and spiritual growth. Self-help and life hacks help, but they will not turn the key to total life transformation that lasts. And creating a plan for sustainable transformation is what Win Today is all about. Lastly, whether you're a new listener or have been listening to the show for a while, I'd really appreciate your rating and review of Win Today on Spotify and on the Apple Podcast app. Until next week, let's connect on social media and on my YouTube channel, and of course at wintoday.tv. Thanks again for listening today. I hope you have an awesome week. We'll talk to you again really soon. Bye-bye.